Steven J. Dubner is an award-winning author and journalist who lives in New York City. He is the co-author, as you know, with Steven Levitt of Freakonomics, a rogue economist explores the hidden side of everything. He is also the author of Turbulent Souls, a Catholic son's return to his Jewish family, Confessions of a Hero Worshipper, and a children's book, The Boy with Two Belly Buttons. Steven Dubner has been an editor and writer at New York Magazine, an editor and writer for the New York Times Magazine, and a contributor for The New Yorker, Time, The Washington Post, and other publications. His journalism has been anthologized in the Best American Sports Writing and the Best American Crime Writing. He's been a PBS correspondent and is a regular contributor to ABC News, appearing monthly on a segment called Freakonomics Friday. He and Steven Levitt also write a monthly Freakonomics column for the New York Times Magazine, and they maintain Freakonomics.com, called the most readable economics blog in the universe. Please welcome Steven Dubner.
Thank you. Thank you. It should be said that the most readable economics blog in the universe is plainly pretty faint praise, if you've ever read an economics blog, but such as it is. Let me begin with an experiment, which all you need to do is raise your hand or not. So by show of hands, raise your hand if, after you use a public restroom, you do not wash your hands. All right, so let me see you raise, if after, maybe you didn't hear me well enough. After you use a public restroom, do you wash your hands? Raise your hand if the answer is no. All right, so I see 0 hands raised. 1, thank God somebody's honest. All right, so we'll say there's 100 people here. There's probably a few less, but we'll say 1 or 1.5%. So if I were basing my decision about hand hygiene on this sample right here, I would say that 98.5% roughly of this population right here exhibits excellent hand hygiene after using a public restroom. Now here's the thing. You look like a fairly honest group of people. Most of you look pretty hygienic in general, but I know that in this case, especially a lot of the men, I just know that you're lying. And I know you're lying because there's actually a fair amount of scientific literature on this, and I've done a bit of it myself very casually, and mine is very simple. I travel a lot, and I'm flying. I get off an airplane, and I go to the men's room, and I use the men's room, and then I wash my hands. And then I just hang out at the sink with my notebook and kind of linger. And I just write down how many people who are coming out having used the bathroom then wash their hands. And so from this, I construct a little bit of a sample. Now, I haven't tried it in a ladies' room yet, so I only know the sample for men. Also, if you're ever tempted to do this yourself, which I encourage you to do, one word of caution: do not try this in the Minneapolis airport, where a certain U.S. senator made scientific research a little more complicated for all of us with his toe-tapping choreography. But what I find, on general, about 70% of men wash their hands and about 30% don't, okay? Now, here's the point. If we brought those 30% of the non-washers in here and sat them with their friends or maybe boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, children, professor, teachers, whatever, they're not going to raise their hands either. The circumstances under which a question is asked, or much more broadly, the circumstances under which data are gathered, have a lot to do with how reliable those data are going to be. Now, we know this in our heads, but our hearts let us deceive ourselves a lot, especially when it's data about us, okay? So the point is this. We all want to fix or change the world in some way, I believe. Whether very small or very large. It may be just within your family, within your schoolwork, within your community, your government, the entire world, whatever it is. But the point is, if you rush off to fix or change the world in the way that you think is best, and you're basing your assumption on how the problem exists and what needs to be done to solve it, you're basing that on opinion or emotion or anecdote rather than some data, you may end up misspending a lot of your energy and a lot of your resources. So what we try to do in Freakonomics and SuperFreakonomics, and I'm not sure we always succeed, but we try to do, is basically tell stories using data to get at what the story is really about, and rather than approaching a topic, whether it's a problem or not, rather than approaching a topic through politics, a political ideology, or emotional thinking about it, we try to use what's called the economic approach. So my co-author, Steve Levitt, is a very, very good, very unusual economist at the University of Chicago who went to undergrad at Harvard and grad school at MIT. And he has done research over 15 or 20 years in which he uses empirical analysis to look at situations that most economists wouldn't go near. And together we try to tell stories about these circumstances, whether it's sumo wrestling or baby names in the first book, to in the new book, terrorism and prostitution and global warming, trying to take a problem, take a situation and describe it in a different way than it's usually looked at. So partly it's by using data, and partly it's by using a phrase that Gary Becker, a University of Chicago economist and Nobel laureate, described as the economic approach. You could say, let me go back to hands for a minute. You could say, who cares about the hand washing thing, right? Like, if you tell me that, even if I tell you that 30% of the men in this room don't wash their hands regularly after using the public restroom, you could say, what's the price of that? What's it matter? Now, people are thinking about this a little bit more now because of swine flu. So it's a public health issue. But let me describe one circumstance in which it matters a lot, which is imagine that you're running a hospital. Okay? Or imagine that you or a loved one ends up in a hospital. The Institute of Medicine a few years back did a survey to look at the unnecessary deaths, accidental deaths caused in hospitals across the U.S. And they found that there are roughly 100,000 deaths per year in U.S. hospitals from causes other than the reason that those patients came in the hospital to not die from. Okay? So if you think about it, if you're running a hospital, you have millions of people coming in essentially to not die, and 100,000 of them are dying each year from something other than the thing that they came in to not die from. That's bad to start with, but here's what's even worse. If you look at the categories of problems that are causing these deaths, most of them are extremely preventable. So some of them are age-old issues that are pretty rare but get on the news when they happen. A doctor will operate on the wrong side of the body, for instance, very rare, but they happen. Some are due to bad handwriting for prescriptions, for meds. Some are due to lack of response, but one of the biggest, probably the single largest category, is bacterial infection that often could have been prevented by better hand hygiene. Now, think about it. In the hospital, who do you think is the guiltiest category of person? You've got all these people, doctors, nurses, patients, families, janitorial staff, food, all these. Which category of person do you think would be most guilty of passing along bacterial infection? Doctors. Doctors are the worst. Now, this is not to bash doctors. There are a lot of reasons why they're the guiltiest party. Some we may know, some we may not. They're the busiest. They have the most intense patient interactions. That said, what's really interesting about this problem is most problems that we try to solve, we figure we can solve them with education. So whatever kind of, financial illiteracy is a thing that I think is a much more serious problem than, or a much bigger problem than we generally talk about. The idea is usually you can solve problems like this, or public policy, public health problems, through more education. What's strange about the hands is the doctors are the most educated people in the hospital. And we've known for 160 years that hand hygiene is really good at stopping bacterial infection. And yet, they're the worst at it. There was a study in Australia not long ago where a bunch of docs were asked to self-report their hand hygiene during a period of several weeks or months of observation. And they came back to the researchers, and their self-reported hand hygiene rate was 73%. Okay, so slightly lower than you all reported about yourselves, but not terrible, not, 73%, not great, but you could say not so terrible. But here's the problem. Those same docs, during the same period as they were being observed, as they were reporting their self-reported hand hygiene rate, were being spied upon by nurses who'd been deputized by the hospital. And those nurses watching the same docs who reported a 73% hand hygiene rate, the nurses found that the actual rate for those same docs was 9%. Okay, so you go from 3 out of 4 people in a group who say they do something to 1 out of 10 who actually do it. What this reveals is what economists like to talk about as preferences, right? Economists are all about measuring your preferences. There are 2 kinds of preferences, what you call declared preferences, what you say you'll do, how you say you believe, for instance, and your revealed preferences, what you actually do, or how your behavior plays out. Not what your stated belief is, but how your behavior plays out. What we spend a lot of time doing is trying to track down and find data or find ways to describe revealed preferences. Because declared preferences don't really count for much. Declared preferences are opinion polls. You know, we've written about global warming in a chapter in the book that has stirred up people very, very vigorously. Now, and we did an interview not long ago on TV, and it was a good segment. The questions were good, they were tough, they were fair, they were interesting. I think we really got to talk about the problem and talk about the issues. The problem was they began the segment, it was a TV segment on Good Morning America, they began it with the latest, I think, Pew poll about the number of people who think that global warming is a serious problem. And the point of the Pew poll and the point of the news stories that emanated from this poll was that many people now are taking the threat of global warming less seriously, right? So I don't remember what the numbers were. It had gone from something like 50% thought it was a big problem, maybe 70% thought it was a big problem a few years ago, down to 60 or 50%, something like that. My response to ABC for putting that on the air was, who cares? I mean, if you want to do a news segment about a problem and you're trying to use data to look at the problem, who cares that 20% less people now think it's a big problem? You know, there are some cases in which opinion polls can be pretty meaningful, but as we just showed with you guys raising your hand about washing your hands, self-reported data, especially about what you think about a topic, it just doesn't really matter that much. So we make the argument that it's not declared preferences, not what you say, it's what you do. And so we try to find data that shows how people behave. And I think probably one of the best examples in the new book is about prostitution, where even though it's a topic that's obviously, you know, not so easy to talk about for a lot of people, especially standing in a church, what we did in this section was working with a co-author of Levitt's named Sudhir Venkatesh, whom some of you may remember, maybe from here. He was at the Society of Fellows at Harvard. And he was the guy who in our first book kind of embedded himself with this crack gang. And Sudhir is just an amazing researcher. He does research and work on the street of a kind that no journalist that I know of really does over an extended period of time. And in the case of street prostitution, we looked at it because it was interesting and because we thought we could learn something about wages, women's wages. We have a chapter that's essentially about women's wages, asking why they are the way they are. Why is it that when there's been so much progress made, there's still, even at the top, even the best educated, most competent women, even in the highest paying fields, still earn less than men? So we're exploring this, and as part of that, we looked at prostitution because it is a labor market dominated by women, for better or worse. And when we wanted to look at wages, again, how do you try to get those data? It's hard. It's an illicit industry. It's full of misinformation. It's full of kind of emotion and hyperbole, and we're informed often by what we've seen in movies about prostitution. And what Sudhir did with Steve Levitt was they decided to do an empirical survey of prostitutes and try to gather data, and they sent trackers, women, usually former prostitutes themselves, out on the street with these women who would sit with them before and after every transaction they carried out and record data on that transaction. So 20 or 30 different questions having to do with the sex act that they performed, the price that was paid, the age and race of the customer, on and on and on and on and on. And found from that, and we write about this in the new book, a lot of real information about the lives of these women. And from that information, you can begin to understand why they do it. Because what we try to do is describe the what, and that's often hard enough. The why is really hard. And the why is essentially a wage question. It's it's hard for me to describe how horrible this job sounds like on every level. And yet women still do it. Why? Well, one answer is that they're coerced, right? But when you look at it, they're not coerced. Now, another answer is that they're drug addicts. The vast majority of them are drug addicts, so maybe that's the driver. And that seems to be largely true. But there's also the fact that it pays a lot more money than they could make doing other work, right? The price is high because it's an illicit good, and these women make about 4 times what they could make in the legitimate market. And many of them do work in the legitimate market as well. So someone will will cut hair on the side, or will work in a hospital cleaning up, but also as a prostitute, they earn about 4 times that amount. Now, what's really interesting, we went back and looked about 100 years ago to street prostitutes in Chicago, and found that back then, even the lowest level street prostitute earned not 4 times what she could make in the legitimate market, but more like 10 or 20 times, a huge wage premium. So you understood why there was a ready supply of these women, even though, again, prostitution I don't think is anyone's dream, why there's always been this supply of women to do it. So we asked a pretty natural question: why did the wage premium fall so much, right? It's still 4 times higher, but why did it used to be 10 or 20 times higher, and why did it fall? Anybody have a good answer for why we think the wages of street prostitutes have fallen so much in the last 100 years? Say it again? Excellent. Did you read the book? Yeah, all right, you cheated. All right. But that's the most compelling answer that we think. So I'm glad you read it. But that's the most compelling answer that we think seems to make sense, which is, yeah, there's competition, and it's competition from every woman who's willing to have sex with a man for free. 100 years ago, there were not that many of them. Extramarital sex before or outside of marriage, societally, the mores were much, much different. And as the mores changed, and now premarital sex, the idea, there was little discussed 100 years ago. Something like friends with benefits, of course, was not at all discussed. So what you had was a kind of influx of supply of women who would give to men the product that they were used to paying for. Yes, you want a question? Yeah. Does it coincide with the pill? The pill definitely played a big role in it. The thing that we see, however, is that the supply of women began before the pill, and so extramarital, premarital, non-marital sex was certainly accelerated by that. But one really interesting piece of evidence in this is that, and I probably don't have the dates quite right. They're in the book. I think it's along the lines of this. In the period around 1920 to 1930, roughly, 20% of all American men lost their virginity to a prostitute. Okay, 1 out of 5, and probably many of the remaining 80 lost their virginity in marriage. We don't know, but we're assuming the number is very high. But here's the key comparison: just a generation later, only 5% of American men lost their virginity to a prostitute. So it used to be that the place that many men would go for sex before marriage was the prostitute. As the supply of free sex grew, the demand for paid sex fell, and as a result, the wage of the average prostitute fell an awful lot. If prostitution were an industry that had a legitimate lobby, like the steel industry. The steel industry in the U.S., when they get competition from foreign steel makers, they go to Congress and they get tariffs enacted and they try to shut it down so that they can still make their money. Unfortunately, prostitution, even though it has many friends in positions of power in Washington, it doesn't have a lobby to shut out the competition. The competition would be premarital and extramarital sex. So as a result, the wage of the average prostitute has fallen a lot. As you can tell, one thing we try to do is ask questions that may not get regularly asked by scholars or writers or otherwise. And I'd like to tell you briefly a story about a researcher named Keith Chen, who's at Yale, who asked a question that is very unusual. And it yielded some very unusual and interesting results. Here was Keith Chen's idea. He's a young economist, as I said, at Yale, untenured, okay, assistant professor at Yale. So the idea is to get tenure, and the way to get tenure, obviously, is to do research, to embark usually on a line of fairly narrow research that you can go deep, that will win the esteem of your peers and your elders and get a lot of publications. So here was the research question that Keith Chen really wanted to follow. He thought, what would happen if I could take a bunch of monkeys and like create a little monkey economy and teach them just to use money and then just sit back and see how they spent it? And what might that reveal about human behavior with money? Now, part of the reason he was interested in this question was because when he was a grad student here at Harvard, he worked with a psychologist named Mark Hauser, and they did some experiments that were about altruism with monkeys. They were trying to condition certain monkeys to be kind of altruists and others to be kind of super self-interested and see how the other monkeys responded to them when they did that. They did experiments with marshmallows, how you could like pull a lever for another monkey. You could pull a lever so that you'd give another monkey a marshmallow, but not for yourself. So the idea was if you're the monkey and you can do that, and the other monkey gets the marshmallow and you don't, when it's the other monkey's turn, does he reciprocate and so on. So Keith had done a little bit of this research at Harvard. Now, however, he's an economist, and when he would go out to lunch with his elders at Yale, these are big-time economists doing big-time, mostly macro research, and they'd always ask him, Keith, what are you working on? What are you working toward? And he'd always just mumble something about, yeah, I'm doing some experiments with currency. He'd never say monkeys because economists don't do monkey experiments, right? It's just not what they've done. But that's what he was really wanting to do, and so he collaborated with a psychologist at Yale, and they built a monkey lab. And the monkey they chose to use was the capuchin monkey, which is a really appealing monkey. It's about it's like the size of a scrawny 1-year-old child with a tail the length of its body. Okay, and there are a couple things to know about the capuchin monkey. The first is that it loves sweet food in particular. Okay, so if you brought like a big vat of marshmallow fluff into this room, and a capuchin came in, what would happen is you would run over to it and jump up onto the edge of the vat and eat like its body weight in fluff. And then it would stagger off over to the corner and it would get sick. It would vomit. And then it would stagger back to the vat and jump up and it would eat it. And it would do this all day long, which if you're an economist, makes them an excellent research subject, right? Now, the veterinarians who were overseeing the experiment at Yale, they would never let something like that happen, obviously. But if you're an economist, you know that their incentive to eat sweet food is very strong, and it's all about incentives and so on. So that was good. The other thing about the capuchin monkey is that they're not a particularly smart monkey, okay? They're a New World monkey, which means they split off from the tree kind of early. And they have a small and a pretty rudimentary brain. But that's exactly why Keith wants to use them, because they're not really even thought to think. He wants to measure kind of what they're hardwired to do. If they were thought to think about anything, they would be thought to think about just two things, which are sweet food, as I said in particular, and sex, okay? Which arguably doesn't make them so different from a lot of people that we all know. And now, of course, the economist wants to give them the third piece of the puzzle, money, right? So you've got tiny-brained food and sex monkeys that he wants to train to use money. Now, how do you do it? What do you do? Well, there were 7 monkeys in a big cage up here, living in the big communal cage, and then there's a little door, and you'd come in, there'd be a small cage down at the end where one monkey at a time could come in and do experiments. And the way it works is all 7 of the monkeys they gave them names. You may know in monkey labs, the researchers usually give the monkeys names. They have, they can call them something. And these were all named for characters in James Bond films. So the favorite, Keith Chen's favorite, turned out to be this one named Felix, named for Felix Leiter, the CIA agent in the Bond films. So Felix would come in down here, down to the end, and you would give him a coin. And he would take the coin and sniff it and try to eat it. And when he would see that he couldn't eat what you're giving him or have sex with it, he'd get rid of it. He'd throw it at you. And if you did it a bunch of times, he'd get mad and throw it harder. And if you did it a lot, he would start to throw other monkey stuff that we shouldn't talk about in a church particularly. So then what you do is you give them the coin, they take the coin, and then you offer food. And as the monkey reaches for the food, you take the coin out of the hand. And like I said, they're not that smart. It took on average about 6 months for these 7 monkeys to learn that if you give the coin, then you get food, okay? So he's got them doing that. And it looks like money. It looks like they're using money, but they're not really, right? It's just a trading game that pigeons and rats do with a coin that makes it look like money. But money is different, right? It's fungible. You can buy more than just a piece of food. It stores its value over time as opposed to just in that cage, but at least he's got him doing it. Now that he's got him working with money, because he's an economist, he wants to see if they can express their preferences with money. And the way this would work is you'd offer all the monkeys different kinds of foods, all for the same price, and see if they had a strong preference about particular foods and if they consistently used money to buy the foods they wanted. So as it turns out, they did. And it was pretty surprising to Keith Chen that, Felix, for instance, his favorite food was Jell-O. They offered them Jell-O cubes, slices of apple, and grapes. Whenever Jell-O was for sale, Felix would buy it. If he had a choice between, let's say, apples and grapes, he would still buy one or the other and eat it because he's a monkey and it's essentially free food. But whenever Jell-O was offered, he showed a strong preference for Jell-O. And the other monkeys had their preferences too. So Keith is thinking, this is interesting. I've got the monkeys using money in a way that we do, sort of, and expressing their preferences with money. Now, being an economist, he introduces into this monkey economy price shocks and wealth shocks, okay? And he wants to see what happens. So with the price shock, he doubles the price of their favorite food to see what happens to them, okay? So Felix is used to coming in, giving 1 coin and getting, I think, 2 cubes of Jell-O in a bowl. But now they change it. You give a coin, you get just 1 cube of Jell-O. So the quantity is halved or the price doubled, whichever way you want to look at it. So we're thinking, these are tiny brain monkeys. They don't know. They're just getting some Jell-O. What do they know? But it turns out that they responded rationally to this price shock, which is to say that when the price of their favorite food rose, they bought less of it and bought more of the other food that was now relatively cheaper. So this is really getting interesting. Keith was still embarrassed to tell the real economists what he was working on, but already he's envisioning all these papers he's going to get to write about this capuchin behavior with money and how very similar it is to what we recognize as human behavior. They're using money, they're expressing their preferences with money, and they're reacting rationally to price shocks and to wealth shocks. Now, being an economist, he wants to mess with them a little bit, and he's just pretty sure that they can't really be much like us. The parallels can't run that deep. So now he wants to test their irrationality, and the way he does that is with a little gambling game he invents that is looking at something called loss aversion. Loss aversion basically means that you attach more emotion to loss than you do to a commensurate gain, okay? And it means that you make bad decisions in life because you're too worried about loss at the expense of gain. And so he runs this little gambling game, and it turns out that he was right, that they were pretty loss-averse, the monkeys, and therefore pretty irrational. In other words, they didn't look like humans anymore. Whenever there was an opportunity to play this game where they might lose a grape, even though they still got a free grape, they basically didn't want to play that version of the game. So he thought, well, it was good while it lasted. The parallels between them and us, or us and them, however you want to look at it, it was good while it lasted, but plainly now they are far more irrational than we are because their loss aversion was so high. So he began to write up a paper that was essentially, the loss aversion coefficient of the capuchin monkey in captivity is 2.43, and here are the conditions under which this finding was reached. But it turns out that there were some other economists who were doing some other experiments with day traders, human beings trading stocks all day, every day. And these economists were measuring them for loss aversion. And they had their brains hooked up with electrodes. They were keeping performance journals, and the economists were measuring their trading in the light of their recent gains and losses. And those economists found that the average day trader in captivity was slightly more loss-averse than the average capuchin monkey in captivity, which is to say that the average male stock trader is slightly more irrational than the average capuchin monkey in captivity, all right? Now, if you're an economist, this is really interesting, because economists make a lot of assumptions about human behavior that are built around a model of rational behavior, right? We've heard it for years and years that economists talk about homo economicus, rational theory, rational behavior, and what that means is that, we all theoretically make every decision while assessing all the information that's available to us, having some understanding of the past, a little bit of predictive future, and that we keep our emotions out of it. But now it turns out that these day traders, in a circumstance kind of similar to the monkeys, were a little bit more loss-averse, a little bit more irrational. So this obviously is yielding a lot of information for Keith Chen to write papers in the future and hopefully win tenure. Yes? I didn't mention it was males, but it was both. It was both, yeah. I think in this setup, I think there were 3 males and 4 females, or 2 males. I think 3 males and 4 females. Oh, for the day traders is males. Oh, you're asking, oh, I'm sorry, misunderstood. How would women do? It hasn't been done for women, but we know from a lot of, we know that women and men are very, very, very different when it comes to risk. There's a story that didn't make it into the new book just because we couldn't get enough data to do it right, about a trading firm in Chicago, an energy options trading firm that was, like many trading firms, 95%, if not more, male. And they felt, this is insane. We make a ton of money by using just one segment of the population. They basically had a lot of mostly white, jockey, Big Ten school guys who went into trading. That was just the culture that they had. And they made a lot of money, but they thought, man, there's all these other people that we don't have. Might they be better? Might they be different? And they actively set out to recruit women for a women's trading group because they believed from the data that they'd seen that women had a very different approach to risk, and that if they were trading in the right domain for them, they might be way more profitable than the men. Interestingly, they had a really hard time recruiting women who wanted to do it. There was, like, culturally or socially, especially, maybe this was because it was in Chicago, it was in the Midwest, many of the best and brightest women that they tried to recruit basically told them, you know, my parents didn't send me to college to have a job where I'm just trading and making money for a living. They really wanted to have careers that were more, you know, that were different. So it was a really interesting conundrum. Unfortunately, that was part of our problem. We wanted to measure the performance of these women, and this firm had a hard time getting enough women in there to have a big enough sample for us to measure. After this last finding that Keith Chen reached with the irrationality, one final thing happened in the lab that I'll tell you, then take some questions after. And if he needed any further convincing of the parallels between the monkeys and us, this was it. It was just a bizarre kind of freak accident. One day, they came in to run the experiments like they'd done thousands of times, and Felix comes from the big cage down here, and on this day, for reasons that no one could ever understand, they'd give each monkey like a little tray or basket of 12 coins, and usually the monkey would gather up the coins and start to buy food in here. But on this day, for reasons that no one could figure out, Felix took the whole tray of coins and flung it back here into the big cage and then ran in after it. So it's like a bank heist followed by a jailbreak, and he runs in, and it's chaos in the cage. There are 12 coins on the floor of the cage, and 7 monkeys go after the coins. It's just total bedlam, which of course reinforces the idea that the monkeys have now learned more about money because they know it has value in this cage and not just in this cage. So they're going crazy after it, and the Keith and the other researchers rush in there to get the money back, and the monkeys won't give them the money back because they've learned it has value over there. So then Keith and the other guys go out and they get a bunch of food to bring it in to bribe the monkeys, and the monkeys take the food and they kind of give up the money, but this only further reinforces the idea that you should steal money whenever you have the chance, because if you steal money, then the people go out and give you a bunch of free food. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Keith Chen sees that one monkey has still got a coin. And he walks over to the second monkey and gives it to the second monkey. And Keith Chen is thinking, you know, what is this? Am I seeing monkey altruism in this culture like I saw, you know, we conditioned them to do at Harvard? Am I seeing the repayment of a monkey loan? What is this? But there were a couple seconds of grooming, and then bam, it's monkey sex. It's the first recorded instance of monkey prostitution in the annals of science. And then just to show how thoroughly the monkeys understood the concept of money by now, after the sex was over, which was like 8 seconds because they're monkeys, right? After the sex is over, the monkey who had gotten the coin for sex promptly brings it over to Keith Chen to buy some grapes for it. I'm sure if there'd been a cigarette machine in the cage, he would have slammed it right in there. So that's those are my stories tonight. I thank you for hearing them, and like I said, I'm happy to take some questions now if you have them. Thanks. Thank you. So could everybody hear the question? All right. Can anybody not hear the question? How these sources that we talk about that are the basis of the story? How do we find them? Some of them are found in the regular way that writers and journalists find them, which is by talking to a bunch of people and asking a bunch of questions and so on. But the huge advantage. So I'm a pretty good writer. I'm a pretty good journalist. But Steve Levitt is better than pretty good. And part of what makes him pretty good. Well, it's not part of what makes him pretty good. Because he's so good, he's in a situation where he learns of a lot of academic research as it's happening. And also, he does a lot of academic research. So the prostitution study was one that he really worked on together with Sudhir. Now, again, you cannot underestimate the value of Sudhir Venkatesh in doing this actual research on the street. It was what made this study believable, worthwhile, remarkable, and all that. And it took a lot of work for a lot of years. So that's what Sudhir does. And Levitt and Venkatesh wrote, I think, 4 papers on the economics of a crack-selling gang, all of which kind of formed the basis of a chapter that we did in the first book. And then on the prostitution, they have written 1 paper so far, and we'll, again, probably write a few more, and so a lot goes into it. Keith Chen was a guy who came and gave this talk at a seminar at the University of Chicago where Levitt teaches. Then Levitt and I went out to Yale to spend a day with Keith and talk to him a bunch. Then, and then you just do the stuff that scholars and students and writers always do. You do a literature review and you talk to other people who've done similar work and stuff like that. So it's just, honestly, it's part of the reason it took us 4 years to write the second book is because most of the stuff you pursue isn't worth pursuing. So for I as a writer and for Levitt as a researcher, probably 9 out of 10 ideas that Levitt has as a researcher don't bear fruit. Because either you can't get good data or the data are too noisy, or they end up telling a story that is just not that interesting, not that surprising, not worth telling. So that's the way we go about it. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you a question about another subject in the book. You use quite a heterogeneous collection of examples that you use. In chapter 2, you made the following statement. It's a rather curious example. You said a surprising fact is that the accidental death rate for soldiers in the early 80s was higher than the death rate by hostile fire for every year the U.S. has been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. It seems that practicing to fight in a war can be just as dangerous as really fighting one. But unfortunately, that doesn't take into account the cost to Iraq and Afghanistan. When America prepares to fight a war, the cost to them is 0. When America launches terrorist attacks on these countries or others, the task is extremely high, much higher than to America. So I wonder whether your economist partner has ever calculated the cost to these other societies of America's wars and compared them, because it seems that they all should be buying life insurance more than any of the ones that you cited in the book. There seems to be a real disparity here on an ideological basis that maybe you could clear up a little bit.
I think that's a great comment question. Everybody hear that all right? We don't touch it at all. You're absolutely right. If I had had a conversation with you as we were writing that, it's the kind of thing that, it's tough. All these stories, one thing that we try to do, as you've seen, is tell a lot of stories. And some of them, like this one, this was a 2 or 3 paragraph story at the end of a section about death and likelihood of death in different circumstances and cancer and so on. You're right. We don't even acknowledge it. And even later or earlier in the book, when we're talking about the trickle-down costs of 9/11, we talk about the cost of fighting the wars. You're absolutely right. We're talking about it from a U.S. perspective only. So it's a perspective we didn't acknowledge, and I think you're probably right. I think it probably would have been stronger if we had acknowledged it.
And maybe in your next book you can take that.
I appreciate it. Thanks. I think it's a really good point.
So first off, I just want to say I'm a little disappointed by how reasonable and well thought out the book was.
How reasonable and well. You wanted it to be less.
The cover made it look so controversial and everything. But the question is, you guys have been getting a lot of flack from evolutionary psychologists saying that, they're a big believer that the common sense, the common stereotypes are mostly true because, if they weren't, they wouldn't have survived. How do you respond to that kind of
Wait, who's
critique?
been getting flack? We've been getting flack from evolutionary biologists? I didn't even know that.
I've read
About what in particular? About the altruism are you talking about,
No,
maybe?
not necessarily altruism, but just the whole common sense knowledge. Like, it seems like a lot of your books are trying to debunk, the common sense myth.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And-
And so the argument is that it's common sense for a reason, and it's right much more often than it's wrong.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I think that's a very valid, I'd say it's a very valid point, and here's what I say. I think we said this overtly in the first book, probably not at all in the second book, but I think it's equally valid. A lot of conventional wisdom is right, but it's not worth overturning if it is. And so I think that you're right. I think that if I were critiquing our books, I would say something like, you're writing about how people use anomalies to form a false impression of something. But, I'll just give a tiny example. Shark attacks, right? We write in the new book about shark attacks and how there's this unbelievable hysteria about them every once in a while. Whenever there's a summer where there's kind of nothing else going on, in the summer of 2001, there was all this hysteria about, the summer of the shark. And just for kicks, we just went very basically just to look at a kind of index of worldwide shark attacks and found that not only are there relatively very, very few. In that year, I think there were 68 worldwide unprovoked shark attacks and 4 fatal attacks. So, as we write, probably more people are killed every year run over by TV news vans covering shark attack hysteria, right? And yet, there's this feeling that it's this huge, huge problem because the anomaly is reported so loudly that people kind of internalize that, and people read the news and then the anomaly sticks in their brain. So if I were critiquing us in this realm that you're asking, I would say, yeah, you guys talk about how anomalies lead to really bad assessments of probability and so on, and yet most of the stories that you go to in depth are an anomalous treatment of a conventional wisdom. In other words, who knows how many conventional wisdoms are mostly right? It's probably impossible to calculate. It'd be interesting to take like one realm, personal finance, personal health, whatever, and just look at 20 things that kind of are going thoughts and see what percentage of them are mostly right and mostly wrong. I'm guessing, 70, 80, 90% of conventional wisdom is right. And so I can see why someone from an evolutionary biology perspective would say, God, you guys are dwelling on the anomalous heuristics that people sometimes get engaged in, and by doing so, you almost magnify the effect that you're criticizing of making too much out of anomalies. On the other hand, I'm a big believer in just like, for myself and for helping other people think their way through the clutter. And partly this is because I come from journalism where we create a lot of the clutter. I see how easy it is for journalists to form conventional wisdom that needs to then be overturned later on. So I wouldn't disagree with that critique at all, but I would say that I think what we do is not less valid because of it, because it's kind of serving a different purpose. That's probably a very unsatisfying answer, but it's the best I can. All right, okay, thanks, appreciate it. Hey.
I was wondering, you were talking before about how male stockbrokers were compared to the monkeys.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was interesting and all, but you said that they took them under study and put electrodes and stuff on their head and found that they were more loss aversion or whatever. And I was wondering if that when they're being observed, could the nervousness of being observed perhaps change the results? And as a person in your profession, are you able to take that into account?
Yeah, great question. So I haven't read that paper in a while, and I'd have to go back and see what they did to account for it. I'm sure they tried to account for it as best as they could, but it's really hard. And actually, a later chapter in the book, we write about the role that scrutiny plays in lab experiments and how incredibly powerful it is. So like we write about these experiments about altruism and how economists and others in the lab kind of proved how altruistic people are, how they're hardwired to be altruistic. And the way they proved it was by doing these money games where you get a sum and then you have a choice to give a sum or not. And our argument is that if you really strip down this experiment and look at the role that scrutiny plays, what you're discussing here, you see that if you just change it a little, if you just change this experiment a little bit, you can wipe away the altruism. In other words, if you're a smart experimental economist, you can make a college student do anything. And we write about this history of experiments, of lab experiments, and I'm guessing most of you know the most famous ones, the Milgram at Yale, where they were getting people to theoretically deliver these hugely painful electric shocks to people, Zimbardo and the Stanford prison experiments. Scrutiny is an incredibly powerful force. On the other hand, what I will say, what I do remember about the paper with the day traders is the brain measurement was one piece of a kind of collage of evidence, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So just like the doctors in Australia, they knew they knew this was a period of observation. Some of their behavior was being publicly observed, and the rest they didn't really know. You try to create a few inputs into the observation of these day traders and try to wipe out as best as you can the degree to which scrutiny is going to change them. That said, we write in the book that anytime you're doing experiments with human beings, there's a lot of room for error, which is why we try to measure behavior in the real world more than in the lab. Because, if you bring a lump of uranium into the lab or a colony of bacteria, they don't care if a guy in a white coat is standing there. But people, no matter how well you try to construct an experiment, they almost always do. So, thanks. Good question. Hey.
All right. You actually set me up perfectly for this. When you were talking about the doctors and how they're the people most responsible for tracking germs,
Yeah.
Where would you believe that janitors and the janitorial staff fit in this? Because wouldn't it be technically their job to make sure that everything's safe, sanitary, and clean? And I was just wondering where janitors would stand on that.
Where do the janitors come in? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. What I know is about the docs versus the nurses. So I'll give you an answer that has nothing to do with your question, unfortunately. It's the best I can do. I do believe in saying I don't know when I don't. That's all I really have. But I did hear a very interesting story the other day when I was talking to an American doc, and we were talking about British versus American behavior. Britain has approached the bacterial problem differently, more stringently. And no, I shouldn't say more. The U.S. is really going after it, but they have different approaches. One thing that the British Medical Association did is they banned male doctors from wearing neckties, because neckties can just act as a kind of giant germ swab going from patient to patient. And they said, look, people used to wear neckties to show that they're important. We know you're important. Leave the necktie at home and say, if you can save one life a year, that's a huge, huge improvement. But as we were talking about this doctor told me that one of the biggest reasons that hand hygiene is better in Britain is for one simple reason, which is that nurses there have more power on the ward. And nurses are the disciplinarians who keep the docs in order, whereas here, his argument was, I have no idea how true this is, whereas here, the docs yield so much more power over the nurses, and the nurses actually don't have that kind of ability to, get them in line. In terms of where the janitors come in, I just don't know. But it's a good question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. You all are so polite, lining up and saying thank you and please. I appreciate it. Yes.
Thank you. Both of your books have given me a great respect for both the economic approach and the way in which a valid experiment is conducted and the challenges that it takes in creating it and drawing the correct conclusions.
Did you rehearse this question? This is very well delivered. This is unbelievable.
Thank you.
There you go. After you, sir. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your...
As a journalist, and that profession uses a lot of statistics, how has it changed the way that you yourself report things, and have you been kind of spreading the knowledge around?
Yeah, so I love that question because I feel hugely important, and so I do try to spread the knowledge around. One way you try to do it is when you write, you show your homework a little bit. So, we do try to do that in the book. It's like, it's sometimes just 4 words in the sentence that tries to help the reader understand how these data are procured and how they're framed. And we often try to show how data are unreliable, to kind of help the reader think about ways in which what they know to be true may not be as true. And we also try to, like I said, we try to say whenever we can that whenever we don't know something, we really try to say we don't know. So there's a piece in the book about the relationship between the introduction of television in the US and the rise in crime. And there's a very strong relationship that's correlation, but we argue causal. As for why, we don't really know. We really don't know, so we try not to say. But I will tell you really briefly, because there are people waiting, that there's a fellow at ABC News TV named Gary Langer who keeps a blog, and it's a good blog, it's worth reading, and he's the data cop at ABC. He's the pollster. He's the guy that writes their polling questions, and he works really hard to try to make sure that they're unbiased, unleading questions. But he also, by dint of that job, he's become their data cop. And then anytime there's a correspondent or producer who wants to get a show on the air and they've got some survey that some group has sent them, or some study that somebody sent them, they have to run it by Gary. And Gary is the one who looks at it and tries to figure out, does it deserve a place in the sunlight? So for instance, you'll get a study. Some producer's doing some piece, and the study will come in from the American Institute of Marriage, let's say. And it says that 89% of Americans believe that marriage is the single most powerful institution, most valuable institution in America. 89%. So Gary looks at it, and you start to ask a few questions. Say, all right, so who paid for the study? So these are the things that we should all be asking all the time. Who paid for the study and who made the study? Well, it was paid for and made by the, the American Marriage Institute. Oh, interesting. How big is the sample? It's 19 couples, 19 married couples, interestingly. And who are these 19 married? Well, they're all board members of the American Marriage Institute. That one goes in the garbage. So there are people who are working now. But I'll tell you, it's really hard for journalists. We are way outmanned. If you think about the resources that are put into persuading journalists of one thing or another using data, compared to what the journalist actually has at her or his resource, his or her resources, it's very, very hard to do. So I argue for more data numerate journalists all the time, but also it's really hard. It's kind of like thinking of the most honest politician you know or could imagine with 100 lobbyists every day. And that's a little bit the situation that a journalist is in. They try very hard to be honest brokers, but it can be hard. Yes, please.
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is it possible that fans of Freakonomics are more likely to wash their hands?
Yes,
second
sample bias, right?
Of course.
You're a very unrepresentative sample you're much more hygienic than most people
I would think.
Yeah.
Either that or the men in the audience.
Either that or the men are just smart enough not to pee on their hands. It may be that, so.
My second question is, if you can get college students to do almost anything, what are the implications for public policy? And if you want to talk specifically about the criminal justice system, that would be great.
Public policy, getting people to do anything, and incentives. Well, the reason the college students are so easy to manipulate, how are we doing for time? Can I just keep going here or what? Should we take these two questions, Stan? Okay, so I'll answer your guys' questions. Incentives, well, I'll tell you, it's much harder. The reason that college students are so manipulatable in the lab is because the lab is such an artificial place. That's the moral of the story that we tell. And whenever you read research about a lab, whether it's humans more than monkeys, you find that they're manipulatable because it's an artificial context and the scrutiny is there and so on. In terms of, let's say law enforcement, law and order, things like that, we'd heard of some municipality that used the message from our first book about why crack dealers earn so little money, and they used that as a kind of public service message to try to convince young guys not to go into drug dealing. I think that probably doesn't work at all. My feeling is it doesn't work at all. Look, life is about some appropriate measure of carrot and stick. If we wanted to stop drunk driving, period, then we could do it. We could set up roadblocks every mile at a great cost, and we could, every time we find someone who's driving drunk, we could kill them on the spot. So a huge financial cost and a huge social cost, but it would work, okay? But that's what makes society contentious and fun and vibrant is there's always a pressure to have an incentive not be too strong and not be too weak. So, I'm a big believer in incentives, but, there are many incentives that an economist might propose to solve a problem that are just politically and humanely impossible. And with good reason. I'm not saying economists have all the answers. Yes, please.
Hi, so I'm an undergrad studying econ right now, and it seems like a lot of where the creativity comes in for economists, or at least typical economists, is in finding a cool instrumental variable or something that works very well. So I appreciate if you had any examples of an instrumental variable that you guys have found. And then secondly, it seems like a lot of where your work differs from the traditional economic work is in the data sets that you use and where you find them. But I was wondering if you also use any creative type of analysis on the other end.
Okay, the analysis is creative, and that's because Levitt's pretty much a genius, honestly. He thinks about problems and data in a way unlike anybody I've ever written about, ever known, ever thought of. You know, and to my mind, one of the simplest, best examples, if you read the part in the first book about catching cheating teachers, it was a very simple problem, but nobody had ever done it. And he wasn't sitting in the classroom watching anybody cheat. He was just using the data. And he looked at the data and thought, if I were a cheating teacher, what would I do? Now, partly, you may have to be born with a little streak of larceny in you to do what he does, because he really is very, very good at ferreting out the incentives of bad actors. And, you know, we write the piece in the new book that's similar to that in some ways is where we write about trying to catch terrorists using retail banking data. Very similar. You're thinking, if I'm a terrorist, a prospective terrorist, someone who wants to blow something up, and if I lead a lifestyle that's pretty similar to other people who are known terrorists in that same time and place, in other words, same methodology, same ideology, and so on, what does my banking behavior look like? How would it differ from everybody else's? And can I stack enough markers one atop the other to create a trap that's tight enough so you don't get overwhelmed by false positives? That is a kind of thinking that Levitt and a few other people do that is really, I don't know if it's a gift or a talent or a what, but it's very unusual. In terms of an IV that's good, that's in the new book, I think one that's kind of neat is, well, okay, this kind of answers both your questions, the last one and this one at the same time. We write about, does imprisonment cause, does a higher rate of imprisonment cause a decrease in crime rate? Now, it sounds like an obvious question, right? Of course it does. You put people in jail, crime rate goes down, but maybe not. You could think of a bunch of ways in which it may not be true. Maybe that when you arrest people, the effort to arrest and prosecute people may consume enough resources so that police are taken away from crime stopping. Maybe when you arrest one big criminal, 3 others swoop in to carve up the turd, whatever, we don't know. So you want to measure that. How do you measure that? Well, what you'd want to do is run an experiment. A real-world experiment where you take, let's say, 20 states randomly selected across the country, and in 10 of them, you lock up a bunch of extra people who otherwise wouldn't have gone to jail. Maybe kind of bad people, but, you know, who aren't going to jail otherwise. And in 10 other states, you let go a bunch of people who are in jail, not killers, but people who, you know, should be in jail and let them go. And then in those 20 states, you sit back and watch the crime rate in those two sets of states and measure what happens. Now, you can't do that kind of experiment. Nobody's going to let you just let a bunch of people go and lock up a bunch of others. But the ACLU actually performs that experiment for us in the form of court cases where they sue states for prison overcrowding. And when prisons get overcrowded in certain states, kind of a random collection of, not necessarily random because they're the states where there's a lot of crowded prisons, when they let them go, then you can track afterwards the crime rates in those states. So you're using the ACLU court decisions as the shock to the system to help measure what actually happens to the crime rates in these kind of random states. And you see that, yes, in the end, the crime rate there did rise, from which you can make the conclusion that, yes, imprisonment, it's very expensive. It's expensive in terms of dollar costs. It's expensive in terms of, you know, human lives. It's expensive in terms of family structure, all this stuff. But if your goal is to keep crime down, it does it. Yes, last question, please.
I was wondering earlier when you said that
You have a very deep voice. Do you do anything with that voice? No, it's awesome. You should be, you do radio or anything?
No, I don't.
You could do it, at least you could do like those sexy man commercial voices. I'm sorry. I've been awake too long today. I'm sorry. All right.
Earlier when you were talking about how prostitutes makes far less money than they used to.
Yeah.
You said it was mainly because of extramarital sex, but I was also wondering if it was taken into consideration that women play a much more ample role now, and they can get more job opportunities aside from what they could 100 years ago, and that they can do many jobs that they weren't allowed to do because they were strictly for men?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's exactly what our chapter is about. And so we do write about prostitution in light of essentially the sexual revolution. So partly it's the sexual revolution created a supply of more sex for men, but really we look, the much bigger question is, what did the feminist revolution, the sexual revolution do? And that's really the question we're asking. So obviously there were many, many, many upsides. And one of the most obvious upsides that it provided opportunities for women who could do many, many other things besides the jobs they used to do. Now, prostitution, believe it or not, was a pretty big sector of the job market, and it's much smaller now. So plainly, you're right. Your question is part of the story of what happened. But then we also look at other parts of the story that are, to my mind, a lot more important. For instance, school teaching, right? So I'm guessing some of you know this, but about 50 or 80 years ago, I think 55% of all college-educated white women who were employed in this country were school teachers. 55% of all college graduates became school teachers. It was one of the few professions that was really widely available to them. After other jobs became available, that number plummeted. And one result of that was that it used to be, if you have 55% of the college-educated women going into one profession, you're obviously getting a lot of the best and brightest women in this one profession. The core of school teachers was incredibly high in talent. As many of the best and brightest women ended up going into different professions with the feminist revolution, the overall talent level of the teaching profession fell. Now, does that mean there aren't still many of the best and brightest women going into teaching? No, of course there are. But the proportion began to fall a lot because many of them were going into other professions, doctors, lawyers, and so on. We show that emergency room doctors, as it turns out, women are a little bit better than men. So every time you go to an ER, you should be grateful that not all these wonderfully bright women are becoming teachers. But you also see that school teachers, as the overall talent level of school teachers began to fall, a generation and so later, the talent level of students, the test scores of students began to fall as a result. So that was a real effect, a real unintended consequence of the feminist revolution. All right, I promise this will be the last one. Oh. We'll talk. Yeah. I'm sticking around. I have nowhere to go except for the Yankees game. I hate to tell you to watch, but okay. I know. You notice I saved it to the end to admit, but thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.